All right, so today we're going to be talking about the Native American experience and Western Europe. So we're going to sort of look at these two areas and then try to figure out how this edge of the old world colliding with the new world creates changes in the politics, the economics, the religious systems of both Native Americans, Europeans, and importantly, let's not forget Africans. And how all these systems are different at the beginning, and then what happens as a result of contact between these different parts of the world. And so today, let's start with the Native American experience. First of all, we have to realize that Europeans did not collide with an empty land in 1492. There were about 60 million people in the Americas, and about 7 million of those lived north of Mexico. There was a whole range of societies: sedentary, semi-sedentary, hunter-gatherers, and gigantic empires. Our first Americans arrived in a first wave about 15,000 to 9,000 years ago, and then about 8,000 years ago we get a second wave across the Bering Land Straits. And these folks were the Navajo and the Apache ancestors. That first wave, the older wave, came from Asia and tended to make it even further south. About 5,000 years ago, we get a third wave. These folks stayed up north and become the Aleuts and the Inuits. But the predominant flow is southward, and the densest populations end up in central Mexico and the Andes Mountains for a very specific reason. It's here that you can have settled agriculture, creating a surplus, and then laying a foundation for wealthy urban societies. And it's in the Andes and in central Mexico that we see America's empires: the Aztecs in Mesoamerica and the Incas in the Andes. Here we've got dense populations, productive agriculture, and aggressive bureaucratic states. For the Aztecs, their capital is Tenochtitlan, which in 1500 has a population of about 250,000 people. In comparison, London has about 50,000 people. Trade and tribute brought luxuries to the capital. They ruled over the wide swath of area around them, and their leadership class tended to be sort of warrior priests and warrior nobles. In the Inca capital in the Andes Mountains was Cuzco, and in 1500 it had a population of about 60,000, where divine kings ruled through a bureaucracy of nobles. So think about how Europe is being ruled at this time, right? It's very similar. You've got a noble class dominating and demanding trade and tribute from those around them. Oftentimes linked to a religious empire. And so these empires don't look all that different from what Europeans are used to in the 1500s. Where things get a little bit different maybe as we move further north into what becomes North America. And here we're going to see chiefdoms and confederacies. As maize or corn spreads from Mesoamerica north across much of North America around 10,000 CE, 1000 CE, we see a foundation laid for new ways of life. And here I'm going to look at the different, let's learn about the sort of different ways of life for Native Americans in North America. And here we're going to see a lot of different kinds of cultures. And I want you to think about how they're connected to the environment in which they live. Okay? The environment here is going to determine a lot in terms of what society looks like, what housing and food and all transportation and trade are going to look like. All these things are dominated by their environment. So our first look is going to be at Cahokia, or the Mississippi Valley. Okay? This city, which is outside modern-day St. Louis, emerges around 1000 CE, and it's a mounded city where you have a powerful ruling class, a sun-worshiping priesthood, and they dominate a gigantic area around what's now St. Louis. In fact, Cahokia is the biggest city in North America until New York City overtakes it in terms of population in the mid 1800s. Right? So there's about 50,000 people that live in Cahokia. It declines rapidly after about 1350, and nobody's really sure why. The best guess is that there's a drought in the outlying regions, and they just can't keep the food processing going. But it's this group that the Spanish are going to encounter in the southwest. Okay? And then let's move to the east, the eastern woodlands in places like the Atlantic coast. Okay? And here we're going to have a bunch of different groups. First, we're going to have in the north, Algonquin and Iroquois speakers, right? These are related languages, but they are dozens of distinct societies. They build their societies based on maize, squash, beans, hunting, fishing, whatever resources are available. They tended to use fire to clear forests, to set up fields. Some groups had one chief, but others had sort of bands of chiefs coming together. So you get kind of a council. And the great example that we're going to need to know here is the Powhatan chiefdom, which is the group of Native Americans that the British first find in 1607 when they found the colony of Jamestown. Okay? Powhatan dominates that area. He's sort of the chief or the lead chief of that group. Okay? Some of these groups would grant power to leaders or sachems, or they would use councils to create these kinds of movements. An example of that council would be the Iroquois Confederacy, where the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas all are brought together by, according to legend, Hiawatha, saying, you know, we can do more and we can be better if we work together. And so when Europeans arrive in British North America, these groups are going to play off one another, right? And that's a key thing to remember about Native Americans in this early period and throughout American history, is that they aren't passive acceptors of what's happening. They are active participants. Okay? They do not just absorb European contact. They actually influence it in quite huge ways. Okay? So these groups play off one another in a lot of different ways. Moving more towards the Great Lakes, we're going to see more Algonquin-speaking groups like the Ojibwas, the Ottawas, the Potawatomi, and they all think of themselves as kind of a single people, but they have sort of different totems. So we're like the turtle people or the bird people, and they are especially mobile, using birch bark canoes to move around the waterways of the Great Lakes. And it's these groups that are going to be especially important in the fur trade with the French. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Okay? But notice how the environment is shaping what's going on, right? The eastern woodlands more settled, more mobile here in the Great Lakes through those rivers, and then even more mobility in the Great Plains and the Rockies. These groups are going to be dominated by hunter-gathering societies in small groups, and their life is transformed by the horse, which is introduced through the Spanish. They become much more mobile and therefore can collide with one another in quite a bit. And so, for example, the Comanches are going to start migrating south in pursuit of horses, and they become these expert riders. And they sort of move south from Minnesota into the sort of lower Great Plains. The Sioux, another important group, are going to move west from Minnesota to dominate a wide swath of land in the Dakotas and in parts of Wyoming and Colorado. And these groups are much more mobile because they have to be. There's not as much growing of crops on the Great Plains. Similarly, groups like the Utes are going to be a little bit more mobile. The Utes, however, find farming a little bit easier in parts of the Intermountain West, especially here in Utah. Moving further, we can go to the southwest, and here the Anasazi people create these large farming settlements from about 600 to 1000 CE. And then they start to move and change, and those that remain become known as the Pueblo people. And they build huge irrigation projects and huge housing complexes into cliffs. Again, we need water in that desert southwest, and so being able to irrigate is critical. And then if we look at the Pacific coast, again, we're going to see kind of like the Eastern Woodlands, a lot of different groups being more hunter-gathering, but in particularly fishing. And these groups will become distinct with their own different languages. Okay? So as we think about these regions, we also have to realize that these folks, these Native Americans, don't just exist in isolation. There are patterns of trade amongst them. They're tied by expansive trade networks. If one group specializes in something, they could share those resources. So for example, the Navajo and the Apache will trade hides and meat for the maize and the pottery of the Pueblo down in the southwest. We're also going to see a regional trade in slaves. These slaves especially captured during periods of war. Leaders of these different tribes will control most of the wealth, but unlike European kings, they will distribute it to be seen as generous and to strengthen their own authority. So for example, Powhatan in the Chesapeake Bay collected 9/10 of what was made in his group, but gave much of it back. Okay? As far as religion goes, most of these native groups are animists. It's really hard to generalize between them all. There are some patterns, though. In the more agricultural communities, what we'll see is that the women grow the crops, linking it to fertility, and the men will hunt. As far as war goes, it could be fought to beat an enemy, but maybe even more important, it's a rite of passage for males. And you'll get these sort of blood feuds happening where if I go and kill your brother, your brothers will come kill me, and it goes on and on and on in what's known as a mourning war. Mourning is in, I'm sad, right? Not the sun is rising. So here, that's sort of the areas or the peoples that the Europeans are going to contact when they arrive. And let's take a look at what Western Europe looks like at this time, just to get a sense of comparison and differences. All right, so in Western Europe, what we see is basically a patchwork, of roughly equivalent kingdoms, duchies and republics that still rely on subsistence agriculture. All right, authority comes from above. Kings own a vast amount of lands, but they still live off of the production of peasants. Local nobles also had power and could at times challenge royal authority. And so why do kings prevail? Well, mainly because of the power held by established institutions like the church and like nobility, but also because they offer safety. Okay? But things start to change around 1100 in Europe. In 1100, the Italians in particular start to push into the Arab-dominated Mediterranean trade, which sparks an economic revolution that leads in Italy to the Renaissance, and that Renaissance spreads northward. So all of this commerce is rising and becoming more and more important, and it benefits the kings at the expense of the landed nobility. And the question here is why? Why would kings benefit from trade more than local nobles? Well, it's the king that gives permission to these merchants to go out and trade. It's the king who creates the cities where these merchants live. And the taxes and the product and all of the wealth that is brought by these merchants comes directly to the king. It isn't shared as widely with the nobles like subsistence agriculture might be. All right, we also see during this period the Crusades between 1096 and 1291, where you get some military success, mostly failure, but more profound is going to be the impact on European society. It intensifies Europe's Christian identity. They see themselves now as defenders of the faith. It also introduces Europeans to the trade routes along the Silk Road and to India. That trade had been dominated for centuries by Arabs, and now the Europeans see maybe there's a way we can get involved here. And in 1517, with the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church finally sees some competition. Spain, Portugal, France remain tied to their Roman Catholic identity, and they seek to win souls for Catholicism in America. The English and the Dutch, primarily, on the other hand, hope to create godly Protestant communities as they move and explore. And so as we look at the Americas and at Western Europe before Columbus, what do we see that's the same? What's similar? What's different? And as these different groups collide, how is that collision going to shape what these folks become, especially here in the New World? And that'll be for next time.